Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. President Biden will welcome President Yoon Suk-yeol to the White House in late April for an official state visit. The two presidents will celebrate 70 years of U.S.-South Korea relations and discuss a wide range of issues from security to economic cooperation. Today, we discuss the recent warming of relations between Korea and Japan, as well as President Yoon's upcoming visit.
This state visit will only strengthen or deepen U.S.-ROK ties, and we are looking forward to celebrating the 70th anniversary of the U.S.-ROK alliance here at the White House.
They're complex, they are complicated, but both President Yoon, Prime Minister Kishida have demonstrated bold vision.
In the studio with me, Mr. Robert Rapson. Mr. Rapson served as Chargé d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy Seoul. He was Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy Seoul and Political Counselor and Acting Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy Tokyo. Mr. Rapson was also the Director for Korean Affairs at the State Department. Also joining us, Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Mr. Snyder was the Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Center at the Asia Foundation. Mr. Snyder's new edited volume is titled North Korea's Foreign Policy, the Kim Jong-un Regime in a Hostile World. Welcome to the program.
Good morning.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Now, Mr. Rapson, South Korea announced that South Korean companies will compensate those people who had forced labor under Japanese occupation. This is a step to reconcile and to resolve the forced labor dispute with Japan. Is this music to Washington's ears?
Well, certainly we support this announcement, and it was big news this week with President Yoon laying out his plan for overcoming the key impediment that has blocked or prevented Japan and Korea from renormalizing their engagement in dialogue. And this is through what he termed a plan to have a compensation fund contributed to by Korean corporation to compensate those wartime conscripted laborers, Korean laborers, that have a lawsuit against the Japanese companies in question. So indeed, it is big news. And, from the U.S. perspective, we are certainly supportive of any initiatives by either side or both sides to improve relations. Japan and Korea are our foremost allies in the region, but relations between them have been frosty. So an improvement is welcome, and it lends opportunity for us to further deepen our relationship bilaterally and also trilaterally.
Mr. Snyder, President Yoon Suk-yeol is a former public prosecutor and not a longtime politician. Do you think is his approach different from politicians in solving difficult problems?
Well, on this issue, I think that it's pretty clear that President Yoon is not acting like a typical South Korean politician and has taken what appears to be an approach based on a principled judgment as related to the character and nature of modern Japan and the importance of the relationship potentially between Japan and South Korea. I think that a lot of that was reflected in his March 1st speech, which really has set the stage for the events that have unfolded. I think the real question is whether or not a non-political approach can escape politics. And here, I think the verdict is still out as to whether or not this settlement can pass muster or public scrutiny because almost all of the actions so far have come from South Korea and not from Japan.
On that point, now, Mr. Rapson, Seoul's plans are facing criticism from South Korea's opposition party and rejection by victims of forced labor. Is this still desirable to push ahead with the plan and seek reconciliation with Japan despite domestic opposition?
Well, President Yoon has made the calculation. His determination is to proceed forward, notwithstanding expected opposition. But the opposition is broad-based in Korea. I saw this morning the release of Gallup polls on the question, and it seems 60% of Koreans do not support his proposal. And even more telling, at least if these numbers are validated, is that 89% of Koreans feel that Japan has not repented enough for colonial wartime era transgressions in their view. So yes, it's a difficult political field ahead. He's taking a bold step, but a politically risky step. And certainly with elections coming up in Korea next year, this issue, which for many Koreans is the third rail of Korean politics, could feature prominently in efforts by the president of the ruling party to secure a majority in the National Assembly. Right now, of course, they do not enjoy a majority. In fact, their numbers are quite reduced compared to the ruling opposition party in the Assembly.
Mr. Snyder, in 2015, Seoul and Tokyo announced a final and irreversible agreement on the comfort women with 9.6 million compensation fund. South Koreans opposed this plan because there was no consultation with the victims. In 2017, President Moon Jae-in shut down the compensation fund. Is there a possibility that a future South Korean government may reverse the latest plan, citing the lack of consultation with the victims?
Well, I think there has been consultation with the victims, and in this respect, I think that the Yoon administration learned a lot from the 2015 experience, because what we have seen over the course of the past few months has been the public unfolding of a process that involved public opportunities for victims to respond, which followed actually private consultations. And so I think that in this respect, the South Korean government has learned the lessons from the 2015 Comfort Woman Agreement, and they have tried to apply them to the forced labor situation. But it does not appear to me that the government of Japan has yet shown evidence that they have learned from the experience of the 2015 agreement. And one reason, of course, is that they may not be quite as sensitive to the domestic political context and implications of these issues, but I do believe that it is a potential problem that so far the Yoon administration's efforts have gone unreciprocated, and the consequence of that could be to more deeply polarize the issue of the relationship between Korea and Japan in South Korean politics, when the goal should be to compartmentalize the Japan-Korea relationship from politics.
Mr. Rapson, Japan, for its part, apologized. Emperor Akihito in 1990 expressed deep regret for colonial rule, and Kono's statement in 1993 offered its sincere apologies and remorse to comfort women. Now, you talked about how South Koreans view this, but does Washington view Japan has apologized enough?
Well, it's not for Washington, and I don't think we judge on what's enough. I mean, this is an issue between Japan and Korea, one of deep historical and sensitive significance. So it's up to the peoples, the governments of both sides to determine what's enough. My sense, though, is that, since Japan has apologized at many opportunities over the past several decades, and if you go back, you can find apologies going into the 60s, but incumbent upon, at a minimum, the current prime minister to reiterate himself the crux of those earlier apologies. I think that would resonate well and go a long way to demonstrate some reciprocity.
Now, Mr. Rapson, you say this is an issue between Seoul and Tokyo, but Washington for decades wanted trilateral cooperation and coordination. Was there any behind-the-scenes consultation from Washington and Tokyo about this issue that Japan should apologize more sincerely?
No, I think, for the longest time, and certainly my time working these issues going back 10 years, we've been very sensitive to not giving the appearance of mediating this matter. This is really for the Japanese and the Korean governments to work through. We're certainly supportive. We're encouraging both sides to find ways to resolve historical issues so that the relationships can move forward. But no, there's certain lines out there that we don't want to cross. Granted, I think the encouragement after the fact is very positive and reflects the high interest that the U.S. places in resolution of these issues so that cooperation trilaterally and, of course, bilaterally can continue on a very positive path.
So, Mr. Rapson, you talked about how the United States does not get too much involved in Seoul-Tokyo relations that does not cross certain line, but you were in Seoul, and that's when Jusomia happened. That's when U.S. officials talked to South Koreans about not stopping that Jusomia. It is in the same context where the United States is deeply involved in Seoul and Tokyo relations.
Not quite the same issues. I understand in your reference to Jusomia and the concerns that generated, but that was a very specific matter that affected our security and the security that we provide for Korea. We promoted Jusomia as a device, a framework that could enhance mutual security, Korea, Japan, and the U.S. in responding to threats from North Korea. And, it went beyond where we thought was appropriate because we had a direct stake in the matter. So we encouraged strongly Korea to reconsider without weighing in on the underlying or the related historical issues, which are of a much sensitive nature and something, again, the U.S. Does not want to give any appearance that we're micromanaging or fine-tuning of responses. It really has to be to the parties themselves, we think, have to take the steps to resolve these problems.
So you say Jusomia is different from historical issues, but isn't that Jusomia incident and how U.S. reacted just a good example of the trilateral coordination that is needed and how U.S. interest is directly linked to South Korean and Japan relations?
Well, certainly security overall is linked to better relations between the two countries and allows the trilateral cooperation to be enhanced. But Jusomia was specific to specific security issues and raising that security through the Jusomia framework was my take, was we were working that issue. And we were very careful to compartmentalize that. We only intervened because this was having a direct impact on our ability to provide the best security we can.
Now, Mr. Snyder, of course, there's not a clear gauge of what is enough apology, but do you think in the minds of South Koreans, is there a benchmark where they feel that they got enough apology?
I don't think that it is how many apologies the government of Japan has made. It is the question of whether the South Korean public views those statements of regret as being accompanied by real sincerity or desire to change direction. And that is where I think that the situation is lacking in terms of moving the needle on South Korean public opinion. And I think we will see if the government of Japan takes an action that meets that mark. I think that we can see a shift in South Korean public views. We just haven't seen it yet. In some respects, I would go back to Kim Dae-jung and Obuchi. Because in 1998, I believe that both sides actually had a positive impression of the other in the late 1990s. And so that, in a way, remains the pole star and the foundation that the Yoon administration has cited as the base for where they want to go. But it also requires the government of Japan to figure out what it's going to take in order to move the needle in South Korean public opinion. I think that the real importance is for Japan to, in a forward-looking way, embrace South Korea as a strategic partner and really try to, cut off the costs and burdens of the past.
If I could just add on to Scott's good points, it's the words are important. And looking back on many of the words, the apologies that have been given by Japanese leaders, they've been fine. But one of the recurring problems that continues to stoke the anger and the frustration on the Korean side is that Japanese public officials then go on to explain or make comments or take actions that seem to undercut some of those words. Visits to Yasukuni Shrine. Going back to explain that the comfort women situation really wasn't factually correct if you go back into the mid-2000s. And other circumstances like that. So it's the follow-through also that counts in addition to the word. But the starting point, I think, has to be with the words themselves. And if Prime Minister Kishida beyond just pointing to his predecessors, himself can make that kind of statement, and I think that would be beneficial. And of course, the other piece we haven't talked about is compensation plans and the possibility of Japanese firms, including the two defendants in the case filed by the Korean victims, if they would be contributing. And I think what we're hearing so far is that the Japanese government has no objection, but a little reinforcement on that side might also pay dividends.
You know, the fact of the matter is that so far what has happened is unilateral from the South Korean government. And in my view, despite the fact that we are in a new geopolitical environment and the Japanese government has demonstrated a deep understanding of the implications of Ukraine and the rise of China, South Korea remains a blind spot for the government of Japan. And I think that it's going to be necessary for the government of Japan to take that next step. And I have actually expectations that might happen in the coming weeks.
So, Mr. Snyder, how did the latest arrangement and the proposal from South Korea and Japan's reception over forced labor dispute set the stage for the upcoming President Yoon and President Biden's summit compared to a situation where they didn't have such developments?
I think that what the Yoon administration has done is to send a signal that the relationship with Japan is not going to be an impediment or impinge on the full scope of willingness to cooperate with the United States. And so it removes that as an issue. It sends a signal that South Korea is fully aligned with U.S. Security objectives. And really, I think that it embraces the idea that the U.S.-South Korea partnership can truly be comprehensive.
Now, Mr. Rapson, Samsung and SK Hynix are the top candidates for receiving subsidies under the U.S. CHIPS Act. However, there are many strings attached. Companies are required to share with the United States government their excess profits. They also have to turn over profit projections and factory production, which industry experts say may reveal trade secrets. There's also what industry experts call the China guardrail, which prohibits investment in China in the next 10 years. What do you think is the major challenge posing to the South Korean chip makers? And South Korean Trade Minister recently visited Washington to ask easing of some of these requirements. Now, since the two presidents, President Biden and President Yoon, are meeting after having one big obstacle cleared away, do you think now is the time for Washington to show some more flexibility?
Yeah, this is a critical issue, the economic security range of matters, and semiconductors, certainly electric vehicles and batteries, are front and center. And this is where Korea has made its mark. I mean, we're talking about flagship companies, Samsung and SK and others, that have made their mark globally and are invested globally, but particularly in China. And this is, I think, where the rub is, more so than perhaps on the security front, is the challenge that the Biden administration's new policy, some of them termed industrial policy, presents for Korea, given Korea's dependence and engagement with the Chinese market. Some really hard decisions need to be made, and I think the U.S. side now will be, certainly in the run-up to the summit and at the summit, will be looking for more signals from South Korea that they're aligned with our objectives and the overall objectives from our economic security initiative. It's going to be a hard one, and the next several weeks are going to be some serious self-reflection on the tack that South Korea will take. We're expecting our good ally, Korea, to be on board. And there's a cost to that. So how they can manage that cost, I don't know. We've seen with the EV battery situation some indication from the U.S. side that they would make some adjustments, but those haven't quite come to light yet. Even more so on the semiconductor side. What carve-out might there be down the road for a Samsung or an SK in the China market? It doesn't look like the U.S. is going to be too forgiving, because this is a very comprehensive framework that we now have in place with particular intention to cut off China from the high end of the semiconductor market.
South Korean companies feel all the subsidies are not that much given all the requirements that they need to meet.
Yeah. That's the lay of the land now. That's the framework that we've laid out. So it'll be incumbent upon Korea, perhaps working with other partners that have similar concerns to make the case to the U.S. that allies and good allies, the best allies, there needs to be some reflection and maybe consideration given to accommodating their interests. But it gets to a core issue. This is decoupling or divesting from China. The U.S. strategy is aimed at that, so it's presenting Korea with an existential challenge in some respects as to how they're going to come down on this key policy involved in the key sector in our point of attack with China.
Mr. Snyder, President Yoon was very proactive in solving the history dispute with Japan. Yesterday, we were at the same forum where there were former U.S. ambassadors, and there, Ambassador Cho Tae-yong said that the deal with Japan is not only about Japan, it's about United States, it's about trilateralism. After South Korea showing that proactiveness, now does South Korea have greater leverage to ask for concessions on IRA and on the CHIPS Act when President Yoon meets with President Biden?
So that's a very interesting question, but I would reject one aspect of the implicit premise embedded in that question, and that is I believe that South Korea should avoid taking a transactional approach with the United States. Just like the United States under the Trump administration made a huge mistake in pursuing a transactional approach on burden sharing with South Korea. I don't think transactionalism is going to get us where we want to be. What we're really talking about is the Biden administration faces an internal contradiction between its aspirations to join with allies in the competition with China and some of the internal aspects related to economic nationalism. And what some South Korean media have called America First approaches as related to incorporation of South Korean private sector elements into a unified strategy. And I do believe South Korean companies deserve to know that they're going to be integrated fairly into the U.S. economy, and the Biden administration has to find a way to do that for this strategy to succeed.
It may not only be about transactional diplomacy, but also about public sentiment that since the Yoon Suk-yeol administration, the Yoon administration joined IPEF, South Korean conglomerates made big investments in the United States. And what happened was IRA, what happened was CHIPS Act. And the public sentiment thinks that it's not about only transactional diplomacy, but the public sentiment thinks that what is U.S. giving to me as an ally?
I understand that this has had a public opinion impact, and I think that that is one of the factors that has to drive the Biden administration to find a way to solve its internal contradiction. Because, as you said, President Biden, made a public and personal commitment to the chairman of Hyundai with regard to his pledge in return for South Korean major investment in the United States. And then the IRA, initiated under the Congress, directly created a contradiction with that. And so the Biden administration has work to do. I think it's a work in progress. Some of the issues that are being talked about as related to what exactly would be needed in order to gain those subsidies, those are subjects of ongoing negotiation. And I would argue that if the Biden administration's plan and industrial policy is actually going to work, they're going to have to iron those details out. And at least on my side, it's not at all clear to me that South Korean companies necessarily have to take the deals or conditions that are being offered. There is space for negotiation on some issues, but I also believe that it may be that one possibility is that the South Korean companies invest in the United States but not take U.S. government subsidies. South Korean government has been very generous in providing subsidies that are, I think, more than sufficient to keep the South Korean semiconductor advantage in place.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. We'll have to discuss more in the run-up to and after the summit. Thank you very much, Mr. Rapson, and thank you, Mr. Snyder.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.